Hello and welcome to tonight's event, Introduction to Bonsai. Tonight we are joined by Aaron Stratten, President of the Northern Virginia Bonsai Society, which is itself a Potomac Bonsai Association club. Tonight we will learn about the art and practice of bonsai. Before we get started, a quick reminder that Aaron is happy to answer your questions. So feel free to put any questions you have in the chat box or the Q&A box, and I will make sure Aaron sees them. Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Aaron Stratten.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm excited that there were several of you interested in joining tonight and learning a little bit about bonsai. I am joined behind the camera. I doubt he'll show himself, but my son Cole is here. And I'm telling you that because while I'm up here with some trees, I'm going to invite him to move the camera around in whatever way he thinks is going to give you a view of what we're talking about. And at some points, I may even have him bring that camera in close so we can look close at some of the things that we're doing. So one of the things that I asked of some of you who were here a couple minutes early, and I certainly invite anyone who's not answered yet, if you'd like to answer this question in the chat, like what is your experience? Have you had bonsai? Do you have bonsai now? How long have you been doing it? And I think that's always interesting because our experiences with bonsai can vary really greatly. I guess converse then is that maybe you want to know about my experience with bonsai. I have technically been doing bonsai for very, very close to 25 years. The first trees that I can put my finger on that I owned were in 1996. So right there at the quarter century mark. And I've got to say, I mean, I still feel like a beginner, and that's not an uncommon feeling for people who do bonsai. There is quite literally a lifetime and more to learn about bonsai. And so one of the messages that I hope comes through as we're talking this evening is that there is a lot to learn. There is a lot to know. That doesn't mean you can't practice when you are a learner. You can have bonsai and be at the beginning of that journey. But there is so much to learn. And so one of the things that is just part of choosing bonsai as a hobby it is to acknowledge and accept that it is a learning process that will go on and on and on. There is just so much to learn. So I have been doing bonsai for 25 years. I've done it in different locations. I've kept bonsai in Arizona and in Indiana and here in Northern Virginia. I have been in Northern Virginia for 20 of those 25 years. So this is certainly the climate I can speak to, which there's some real something to that in terms of knowing where you are and what the climate is that you're dealing with, because we're dealing with living plants that live in that climate. And so that's an important thing to think about. I have only been a member of a bonsai club for 6 or 7 years, and I'm getting really bad at estimating how long that's been. I'm going to need to go do my own research to figure out when I joined the club, because of course, 2020 makes a whole year disappear, so it makes it even harder. I've been a member of the Northern Virginia Bonsai Society for those 6 or 7 years, and I've actually been president for over 3 of those. That probably just says that that my arm could be twisted more than it says anything else. But as president of the Northern Virginia Bonsai Society, I have great appreciation for all the learning that is out there and all the expertise that is out there. And to be a member of that club and be surrounded by people who have different experiences, and in some case, much more experience than I. In fact, one of our senior members has actually been practicing bonsai a year longer than I have been alive. So much respect for that. So I hope that that's a little bit of a background for you. I do have all types of plants, not all types, but I have many types of trees that I am keeping as bonsai. And I'll show you a few different varieties and hopefully demonstrate that there can be a great variety in the types of trees that we work with. I did at one point this spring hit 100 trees and very quickly felt like maybe that was too many. And so I think I've given a few away since then. And so I'm in the 90s still. So that's a lot of trees. It's a lot to take care of. It's a lot to learn from, and it's a lot to experience with. So, so what I'd like to do this evening is kind of structure some of the things that we're going to talk about based on basically frequently asked questions, right? As an introduction to bonsai, the topic of this, it seems appropriate to think about what are those questions that people who maybe don't have a lot of understanding of bonsai, what are those questions that they ask? And can we use those to structure the things that we're going to talk about? So number of different things that we're going to hit on, including at least a little bit about actual care and styling and things like that for those of you who do have trees, and hopefully get you going down the right direction. So let's start with the most basic. What is bonsai? And first of all, although I'm certainly guilty of this on occasion when I'm feeling casual, the word is bonsai. It's a like bone, like the bones in your body. And sai like bonsai, okay? And I say that because there is a difference between bonsai and bonsai. And in fact, the spelling is different. Little trees in pots are bonsai, and that's B-O-N-S-A-I. And bonsai, B-A-N-Z-A-I, is actually what the Japanese kamikaze pilots would shout out as they were crashing their planes into one of our vessels at sea. So, and in fact, the translation of that is something like 10,000 years, as if to say, long live the empire. So bonsai is not what we're talking about here. We are talking about bonsai. Bonsai is, in Japanese translation, it is a Japanese term. Bonsai comes to us as a Japanese art form, but in fact, it started in China a long time before it was kind of imported into Japan, even though the world's come to know it as a Japanese art form. But the word bonsai is Japanese, and it can be broken into those two parts, bone and sai. And the bone is actually the pot or tray. Literal translation of bone is like a tray or a pot. So that thing that holds the tree is a very important part of the word. And the second part of the word sai is the plant itself, the tree. So very literal, simple translation, a tree in a pot. Of course, I think we probably all know from seeing bonsai that it's more than that. It's an art form, and bonsai is, in its simplest, I think, the attempt to represent a very large and very old tree in miniature in a pot. Right? So that is something that we're going to come back to and that I'm going to remind you of, because our goal is to make something that looks like a really old tree and shrink that little idea of an old tree into something miniature in the planting that we can care for. So that's what bonsai is. That's what we're going to start with. Bonsai has many different sizes, many different styles. The sizes of trees that I put in front of you here don't have a huge range. This guy from the top of the pot to the top of the tree is right at 9 inches. That means that one's technically a shohin, which is just a Japanese term for a size that basically means a one-handed tree. And so they range from the shohin up to larger trees in the 12, 14, I don't know how tall that pine over there might be, but maybe 24 inches. And bonsai can be much larger and much smaller. If you really get into looking at images of bonsai online, you may see bonsai that are literally held in the palm of the hand and just like 3 inches tall or so. And there are some really large bonsai out there in the world that approach 7 and 8 feet tall. So they can be really large, very, very tiny, and everything in between. And in fact, the sizes are often something that is kind of a personal preference in terms of what you like working with. One of the things that I think is really important to address, and one of those frequently asked questions, is what kinds of trees can be bonsai? And so this is really one of the reasons that I brought several examples in today, and wanted to show you some of these, talk about what these different types of trees are, just so we can see some of those examples. A few of you shared that you have bonsai. Somebody said they had an elm. Somebody said they had, I don't remember some of the varieties that you said, but let me
Myrtle was one, and a pine, I believe, are
right?
some of the ones listed by the audience.
Great, great. So the shortest version, when somebody says what kinds of trees can be a bonsai, is that any plant that has a woody trunk can be trained as bonsai. Now, that doesn't mean they're all going to be great bonsai. There are some oaks out there in the world with leaves that are like, 10 and 12 inches long. You could raise an oak with those really large leaf styles as a bonsai, but it'd be hard to get it to really be a really nice bonsai in time. And there are ways to get the leaves smaller, but there are limits to that. So let me show you a few different varieties. This is a ficus, and many of us have ficus in our homes as house plants. In fact, this is a Ficus Benjamina. The Ficus Benjamina is a very popular house plant. So these are evergreen broadleaf, but they're tropical, and that has very specific implications. And so as a tropical plant, the Ficus Benjamina actually needs to come in during the winter, but I definitely put it outside in the summertime. Another example that I'll put right up here, that is something that is really available to us in our area. This is an azalea. So azaleas, many of us probably have azaleas in our garden. And yes, we think of azaleas with that springtime bloom, and they can be covered with flowers. And that's absolutely true with bonsai as well, where you can create an azalea bonsai that is absolutely covered with flowers. But during the rest of the year, just like in the garden, they're a nice broadleaf, green-leafed tree. And the azaleas that I have as bonsai are evergreen azaleas, but there are deciduous varieties of azalea as well. Another tree that many of us may have in our gardens in one form or another is the Japanese maple. Japanese maples, of course, come in a wide variety with different leaf sizes and leaf colors. There are red varieties, there are weeping varieties, there are lace leaf varieties. But the Japanese maple, as a deciduous tree, is really lovely as bonsai because they do go through all of their seasons. And so I get to look forward to a little tree like this changing color in the fall, dropping its leaves in the winter, and having that bare branch winter silhouette to look at even during the winter time. So that's a Japanese maple. Very quickly here, I will show you a boxwood. Boxwood is another type of plant that many of us might have in our gardens. And this is a theme. I'm going to come back around to this a little bit. Boxwoods are evergreen. They're a broadleaf, but they have a very tiny little leaf, and they grow pretty dense. I mean, you can see that the density of these leaf pads are real. I mean, it's almost dark in there. You really can pull this away and still have tons of small leaves down inside. So they can be really nice to work with as bonsai because they have these tiny leaves that all grow close together, and you can do a lot of interesting things with boxwood. We have a pine over here. I can move that pine over, take a quick look at it. And there's many different varieties of pine that make great bonsai. This is actually a Virginia pine, which is a little bit experimental for me. There's lots of information out in the world about black pines and white pines, which are traditional pine species from Japan that have long been kept as bonsai. And so we can learn from those people who have kept those pine species for a really long time to know how to care properly for those pines. And one of the things that we know about pines is that you have to care for them differently depending on the precise species. In fact, the Japanese black pine and the Japanese white pine, you actually have to treat them very different in terms of the way you prune them, feed them, and everything. So it's really kind of interesting. So I wanted to show this variety, and here's the last one real quickly. That is a holly. This is obviously a small leaf Japanese holly, not your Chinese holly that's got big prickly pointy leaves on it. But the holly has a fine leaf, much like the boxwood. And so I'll go ahead and have Cole back up a little bit here, and we'll talk about a couple of other things, and then we can get into some of the work that we can do on the trees, and I'll do a little on this little guy. But with all those different varieties of trees that you can use as bonsai, and so many more. This was just a selection that I brought in to show you guys that I thought would be easy to move around. But with all those different varieties, I think one of the questions that comes next is, well, where do you get those, right? Where do you get a plant to be a bonsai, or where do you get a bonsai is what most people ask. And while there are garden centers, there are actually, bonsai gardens that you can go to and buy a bonsai. That's actually not what I would recommend as your first and foremost location. Now, when you talk about where can you get a bonsai, there are, of course, there are times when you can probably find one in a mall, right? And we literally have a joke word, we call them mallsai. Or if you go to a big box store, including like a Lowe's or Home Depot, and see a little bonsai on the shelf with some of the other house plants. Yeah, you can buy a tree in a pot that's presented as a bonsai. But when it comes down to it, where you get a bonsai is not necessarily from a place that's trying to sell you something as a bonsai. You can go buy a little holly shrub from the garden center, not being sold as a bonsai, and you can change that into a bonsai, because bonsai is how we care for the tree, how we prune it, how we train it, that we keep it in a smaller pot, right? So if you buy that holly from the garden center, it might have a trunk like this, and it might be a bush that is a good bit bigger than this, and it might be in a round black plastic pot full of potting soil, right? But that plant still has that potential to be a bonsai. So the question is, do you have the skills and the knowledge to take something from that nursery pot and get it into a smaller pot over time without killing it, right? And to prune it and style it into something that has the look of a whole tree, an older tree, through the different processes that you take. So thinking about where to get bonsai, you've got those things that you can buy as bonsai. You can go to actual bonsai gardens. I mentioned earlier a PBA festival that happens at the Bonsai Museum at the National Arboretum, and when they have vendors there, they are actually vendors who do bonsai, and raise bonsai and sell bonsai for a living. And so you can get some good stuff there. But one of the pieces that I definitely want to make sure that we don't overlook is I'll use the Japanese term and Japanese concept of Yamadori. So Yamadori, Yamadori, is a Japanese term that essentially means from the mountains, right? And so this little guy was actually dug up from a wild place here in Northern Virginia. And so I found this tiny little holly, and I dug it out of the ground. I helped it recover from having its roots damaged through that digging, and eventually got it into a smaller pot. The Virginia pine, very much the same thing. So not in a literal sense, these are not Yamadori from the mountains, but in bonsai circles, Yamadori is oftentimes used in a term that means it's been collected from the wild, right? I also, though, mentioned in many examples of the plants that we were looking at that this is a type of plant that many of us grow in our garden. And I have more than one tree in a pot that I am training as a bonsai that was at one time literally growing in the garden in my yard. That includes at least one azalea that I've got, not the one I showed you there. I've got a privet that was just part of my landscape. And so we have our own gardens, the plants that we might grow in our own yard, and we also have the gardens of others. And those of us who are in search of more material or interesting material might really start to pay attention when we have a neighbor who's tearing out their shrubs to put in a new flower border or something like that, and we can offer to take those. So those types of things happen.
You have a couple questions.
Okay.
The first
quick that the boxwood that I have here was actually ripped out of a neighbor's yard probably 15 years ago, and they literally tossed it to the curb next to the trash can. But I drove by and picked it up, and here it is 15 years later. So let's have some of those questions.
Couple questions. So Colleen writes, there's a lot of different species of bonsai out there. Is it generally safe to keep bonsai in a household with pets?
So I definitely have pets. The question's a little loaded because one of the things that we hear a lot is that someone gets a bonsai and then it's not healthy and something's wrong and I don't know what's wrong with it, and we find out that they've kept that tree inside for many months or longer, and so in a house, it kind of sets off the alarms for me because most of the trees need to be outside. If we're talking about a tropical plant like the ficus that I showed you, then that my tropicals are in the house half the year and outside half the year. If there are varieties of plants that are dangerous for pets to come in contact with, that's definitely something to keep in mind. And one of the things that I've struggled with over the years with a dog is that while many of my bonsai are in different places around the backyard, there are types of fertilizer that the dog would actually want to eat. So finding a type of fertilizer that she wouldn't eat was the eventual solution to that problem. But over time, I had to try different things to try and keep her from eating the fertilizer because I'm sure that was not good for her. But generally, there's not a problem. You just don't want to intentionally select a tree that actually has poisonous characteristics.
We have another question going off of that. Brian asks, which species do you recommend for keeping indoors?
Yeah, so for keeping indoors, you really want to be looking at something that's tropical or subtropical. I do think I've heard that the Chinese elm is approaching that subtropical classification, and Chinese elms can be great to work with. And so that's a possibility that, as I understand, can be kept indoors. The tropicals that you're dealing with, of many different varieties of ficus. I showed you a Benjamina, but there's also Ficus salicaria and a small willow leaf ficus that has a tiny little leaf on it, and a number of different ficus varieties. There are, Sarissa, I can't sit here and name tropical plants because there are actually tons of them that make good bonsai. So if you have a place where you know you can get tropical plants, those are things to look at and consider. But meeting the needs of tropical plants is not all that easy. In fact, what I find is that my tropicals, when I bring them in for 6 months of the year, they kind of pout and suffer a little bit over those months inside. They certainly aren't growing well. They're staying alive. And when I get them back outside and the weather's getting warm and they're getting that actual sunlight, and they start reinvigorating, building up that strength again after they've been outside for some time. In fact, I put them out usually mid-May once the nighttime temperatures are above 50 degrees. And it's really not until the beginning or middle of July that they really start showing enough strength for me to feel like they've really recovered from their time inside. So, there's challenges to keeping plants inside, because the tropical plants that will tolerate being inside year round are actually from places where they're going to have all kinds of high humidity, lots of interaction with the natural world. I won't say lots of light. There are some tropicals that live in pretty shady parts of the forests, but meeting their needs is not always easy.
He wrote to follow up saying he has a Chinese elm.
Good.
We also have a question from Stephanie. When you're repotting the plants you find in the mountains, what kind of soil do you recommend? Does it depend on the plant? The soil in her deciduous Brazilian rosewood bonsai pots don't seem to retain water very well. So the leaves on the bottom turn brown and die very quickly. So when you are finding that fertilizer that works for your dog, and when you are repotting those, what do you use for soil?
So soil is a huge conversation that I don't want to go too deeply in for a introduction to bonsai. Cole, will you grab the azalea on the back side of the table there? But yes, the soil variety that is used, and you can bring the camera into, in a lot of, that was a bad choice, in a lot of bonsai is very granular. And so I'll just kind of take a pinch off of this and show you here. And this is a type of bonsai mix that I was putting together that in fact I'm trying to get away from. But the illustration here is that these are large granules. We're not talking about dirt. We're not talking about potting soil. When you look at some of these other trees, let me see what I've got down in here with this guy. I have a lot of these topped. I want to get to a soil surface we can see at. I have them topped with a little bit of moss, but that's like sphagnum moss and green moss that's collected and put together. And so I kind of have to dig down. And this one's been in the pot for a couple of years. So that soil's starting to break down, even though it was very granular soil before. So you can see it starting to break down, and that it looks much more like dirt. Because it's breaking down over time. Let me grab one more as an example. This is a good example because I actually repotted this one this year. So this is in the soil mix that I'm using right now. And so if I just pull a little pinch out there and try and show that to you, I'm actually using 3 different ingredients in my bonsai mix. And those are pumice, which is the white stuff here that is a volcanic type of stone. Lava rock, the red lava rock, is also a volcanic stone, and something called akadama, which is reddish also, but this is kind of wet right now, but it's a clay material, but it's a volcanic clay, and akadama is actually collected and harvested in Japan. So I'll let you go back up there, Cole. But the that granular nature of the soils that are used in bonsai are with the intent of really trying to control the environment inside this pot. we need to be able to have a good understanding of how much water is needed, make sure that they don't stay too wet for too long, and be able to control the nutrients that we're putting in there, applying fertilizer and that sort of thing. And one of the things that I don't think they teach well enough, even in middle school science, is that plants need air. Plant roots need air. And I've probably, this is only a suspicion because I don't have autopsies done on my dead trees, but I've probably lost more trees to like root rot, basically having the roots too wet for too long, than any other cause. And until I started using a proper granular soil that would let that water flow out fairly quickly, and not stay soggy, is when I started getting better control over the conditions in the pot. The downside to that is that if you use the types of soil that I'm talking about, watering is necessary more frequently. And so it becomes a lifestyle choice. People own bonsai that are not able to use the right kind of bonsai soil, because if they use that, they just are not able to water their trees as frequently as that requires. Most of my trees, except for some of these very, very hot days we've had over the last couple of weeks, wouldn't ever need to be watered more than once a day. Most of them less often than that, so I can water them and check them daily to see if they need more water. But only when we get super hot weather do I need to water multiple times a day. So if you have a pot that is drying out really fast, there are things you can do, including putting like a layer of moss or mulch on top that tries to hold some of that moisture in. But the type of soil has a big difference. You change the soil, you have to change your watering, you have to change your fertilizing. And so there's a lot of balance to that, and a lot of learning in that kind of realm of working with different soils in your trees. How are we doing on questions? Do we have some more?
We have more. A lot of them are things that I think you might hit on as you go through your FAQs. So I'm going to keep them, and if you don't hit on them, I'll get them asked, okay?
All right. So another thing that people ask about a lot is, this is a little bit silly, but it relates to the trees that we've been looking at, is people all the time will say, how old is it? There's this kind of idea that a bonsai is a really old tree. And while we want to give the image of a really old tree, that doesn't always mean the tree itself is really old. When they're smaller, that's especially true. But if you just think back to some of the things I suggested, like what if you were to go to Lowe's and go to the garden center and find a nice big juniper shrub, but bring that home and then train it and prune it and keep it as a bonsai? That juniper shrub sitting there on the shelves at Lowe's is probably not very old, because they do those from air layers and then they remove them from the parent plant once they grow some new roots, and they put them in a pot and they get them strong and healthy, and then they send them off and sell them. And that might only take a couple of years. And that's a bit of an estimate. I don't really know how fast that process goes in terms of raising plants to sell at garden centers. But you're technically talking about a tree that's a couple of years old, but it could still have a trunk that's as thick as my thumb or maybe even bigger. And so how old is the tree doesn't always apply in really appropriate ways. When you're talking about Yamadori, an actual like pine that was collected from high up in the Rocky Mountains, then you might want to talk about age. But then when you do, you're always estimating. When you're talking about really harsh conditions where trees might be collected that are kind of naturally dwarfed from being in that environment, those trees do grow very slowly. And so you could have a tree that was no bigger than that pine that I showed you that could be, 100 or 200 years old. But all you can do is estimate what that looks like. So Another question I wanted to hit real quick and then maybe talk about using some of them is what kind of tools do you need? And so Cole can come over here and show you some of the tools. And this is pretty much my short set of, you know, a half dozen tools that I use on a really regular basis. This is literally just a piece of bamboo, and chopsticks are a standard tool of bonsai practitioners. It's true. A good pair of shears. Yes, I own different sizes, but this is the one that I go to almost all the time. Different types of cutters that have concave cutting surfaces so that you can cut larger branches off. That's a concave cutter, and a knob cutter that's also rounded on the cutting surface. Wires, wire cutters and pliers. And all of these are technically bonsai tools. There are bonsai tools and bonsai tool retailers that you can buy from. But the reality is, if you're getting started, you don't need to run out and like buy a set of bonsai tools, although there are certainly plenty of people who are willing to sell them to you. If you get a really nice pair of garden shears from a garden center that sells some tools, a really, you know, nice pair of wire cutters, a good plier from your garage or wherever you keep your regular tools, those things can really get you started. And then you can just start getting those tools that you want as you are kind of continuing along your way. You know, you can go to the PBA festival, and those people that are selling plants and selling bonsai are also selling tools and pots and turntables and things like that. So I want to get into a little bit of the actual what you do when you do bonsai. And I'll invite Cole to like bring the camera back, and I'll just say a little bit about pruning on this guy as I do a little bit of it, but I want to talk through a couple things while I do. So I hope that there's enough light here for you all to see. But what we have here are these extensions that have grown out. And if you can see, I don't know how tight we're going to be able to get in, but right there is actually a cut that I made several weeks ago. And from right by that cut, we have this new branch that's grown out since then. And from this branch, this leaf is at the base of it, and I'll go ahead and get that out of the way. But then I have a couple of leaves here, a third leaf, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 10 leaves if I have a couple here at the end. And what I want to do is keep pushing this little tree back by cutting back to just 2 or 3 leaves on some of these new branches that have come out. So I'm actually looking down in there, seeing where those leaves are, seeing if I can figure out where leaf number 1 and leaf number 2 is, deciding if I want to cut after leaf number 2 or leaf number 3, and taking this down. And what's going to happen is that process that I just described will repeat. So from the tip of this, wherever I make this cut, it will, sometimes it's hard to find where I cut last time. It will probably send out a new shoot. And you keep doing this process, and the branching gets finer, gets thinner. I'll rotate around to here a little bit. And you start getting more and more branches. So like right now, if I go through this, I may end up cutting, 30 or 40 branches. Well, if next time or this time next year, I'm cutting 50 or 60 branches, then I've got even more branches that are creating the shape of this tree, and it's getting better and better. So
how often do you do that to a plant?
So that is a great question, and the frequency that you prune is all about the health of the tree. And so that's actually one of the things I wanted to really emphasize as we're starting to talk about how do you do bonsai. And you always have to make sure that you're putting the health of the tree first. In this particular case, I've got a really vigorous tree. I didn't look it up to check to see exactly when the last time was that I did this, but it was probably 3 or 4 weeks ago. And so to have this much growth in 3 or 4 weeks time shows me that this tree is absolutely going gangbusters. It's happy, it's growing strong, and that is kind of a hint to me that I can do this work. And so how often do you do it is partially responding to the tree to know how often you can do it. When is it ready? You know, if I'm leaving 2 or 3 leaves at the base of this new bit of growth, then I want to be cutting off 6 or 7 leaves. So if I think in those terms, then that means I'm waiting for 9 or 10 leaves to grow out so that I can go in and cut it back to 2 and let that process of strength and growth and vigor continue. And I want the tree to stay strong. So, you know, there's a lot of misconceptions or assumptions about bonsai that it's, you know, torturing the tree, that it's, you know, you starve the tree to keep it small. But clearly, if I was starving this tree, it wouldn't be pushing out 10 new leaves in 3 or 4 weeks. So that's just, you know, not at all the way we want to be working with our trees. We want to keep them strong. We want to keep them growing, especially most of us on most of our trees, because most of us and most of our trees are very much in the early development stages. And so that's part of how you do bonsai that I think is a really important part for most of us to be thinking about. The information out there in the world about how you do bonsai, and by that I mean when you buy a book about bonsai, when you read a blog about bonsai, when you watch a video done by a bonsai professional on, you know, repotting or restyling a tree, they're almost always working with mature material. But most of us are not. Most of us are working with plants in development. They're not even fully designed bonsai yet. They're just getting there. And so that type of thinking or the activities that you do with a fully developed tree are different from those that you do with a tree that's in development. So you really need to treat them a little bit differently. That's the long way of me saying I'm not going to tell you how often. A tree like this, though, because it's strong and it's vigorous and the way it grows, I can probably do a pruning like this 4 or 5 times during the growing season, depending on how well it's doing. But that's a holly, and the azalea, which happens to be sitting here, I'll prune that once per year. Okay, that wasn't 100% true. I will go through and do a solid pruning on this after it's flowered. And then maybe at the end of the summer or into the fall, I'll go through and I'll just be removing stuff that's going the wrong direction, something that's growing straight down or something that's growing in, you know, inward toward the center of the plant rather than branches that are coming outward. Maybe if I have something that's really extending super long, I could shorten it. But with an azalea, I want to do a big prune on it and then let it develop and grow out, because this is actually already starting, at least internally, to set where the flower buds are going to be next year. And if I do any pruning on this between now and next spring, I'm cutting flowers off. For some, that's not all that important, but I want this tree to continue to develop. So that's where the approach to pruning depends on the species. Another example is the boxwood that I showed you a bit ago. And the boxwood is another one that I prune usually just once a year. It pushes out a nice flush of spring growth. And and then that spring growth kind of stops and takes some time to harden off. And when the spring growth is hardened off, it might start growing a little bit more at the end of the summer, but usually that's the growth that I can depend on. So it's just that one round of growing that I can count on. And so I end up pruning it just once a year. Styling, however, is a little bit different. And I'm going to invite Cole to take a half step back, and I'm going to bring something big over for you. We have other questions that are lingering? Did I answer the last?
Yeah. So Brian, who also asked the question about how often to cut the branches, Brian also wants to know, he gets small flies or insects on his plants. How do you deal with pests on bonsai?
Our pests and diseases are a huge category of learning in bonsai, because there are a lot of things out there that can happen when you have any plant anywhere. It could potentially be infected by all kinds of things. There are viruses and bacteria. There are fungal infections. There are all kinds of insects that want to do different things to your plant. Usually feed on it somehow, somewhere, lay eggs on it so that the next generation will grow up on your plant to eat it as well. So yes, it's really hard to deal with, but this is where I think learning about bonsai and getting involved with others who are doing it so that you can learn from them is probably one of the best things that you can do. I'm not trying to get you all to join NVBS and pay dues or anything like that, but when there's a pest that I encounter that I hadn't seen before, or I don't know what to do with it, a lot of times I can call on somebody who has more experience than I and say, hey, is this something that you know about? And it oftentimes involves a lot of research and trying to figure out what it is, trying the best way to manage it. Yeah, I know that there are some bugs that will be on your plant just because you water it too often. And all you got to do to get rid of those particular pests is control your watering better, right? So, in other cases, it's a really serious problem that you need to address with some sort of insecticidal something. There are organic solutions like a neem oil, insecticidal soaps, and things like that, and stronger materials that are available out there as well. Let me say something real quick about this, and I'm going to start working on it while we continue to talk and I answer questions. I am seeing that we're getting close to 10 till 8. So time keeps chugging along as it does. This is another boxwood. I actually collected this boxwood out of a yard from a person who knew members of our Bonsai Society and thought, oh, you know what? I don't want my boxwoods anymore, but I wonder if those guys over at the Bonsai Society would like to have them. And so they were offered, and I went and dug this old boxwood, and you can see that there was another very large trunk here that came up out of here, and it died. And so we even have dead wood down the trunk. We have dead old roots that are sticking out here, and I think it's made a really interesting kind of visual. Give you a little quick kind of rotation so you can see what's going on, and you can actually see the difference between the dead wood here and the live bark. A nice line of live bark right there. And so the live bark, as we come around, kind of goes all the way across a half or better of the tree all the way to this side. And so these roots that I have coming down on this side of the tree are the live roots that are feeding this whole tree. I actually had this in a large box recovering in that granular mixture of soil on top of and around the soil that I dug it out of the yard with for a number of years. And the tree was just removed from that pot this spring to get into this ceramic pot. So I was very excited to kind of get to that stage of its development. And then I've been waiting because when I repotted it, it was a big deal to get out of a big box that was almost 24 inches square into this 12-inch ceramic pot. Took some big pruning, but the tree had been really strong. It had been growing well. And so it's that kind of responding to the tree thing again that that we need to really pay attention to as we are deciding what work we can do, when we can do it, if we should do it. And so I waited to put wire on this guy, and wire is something that we hadn't really talked about yet. But you can see, if Cole, if you want to come in here, I've wrapped wire around these branches, and that allows me to take a branch, put it into a position that I want, put a bend in it that I think will be beneficial to the design and style of the tree, and move these parts around to get interest built into the tree. One of the things that we've said a couple of times already is that we're trying to get the vision of an old tree in a smaller plant, right? And so old trees tend to have branches that bend and curve and twist. And so to add a little bit of movement in some of the branches. Another thing that we find if we look at old trees and try and study what they look like, is that with age, those branches get longer and heavier, and so they get weighed down. Exactly what that looks like in different types of trees is different. If you see like a pine tree in an alpine setting, those branches will literally be down because they get those snow loads that bend the branches down. In the case of like an old deciduous tree, which I would argue is more the image that I'd be going for in something like this one, the branches might bend down, but that would be more in terms of like that the branch that's so old that it's just kind of bending down under its own weight. But deciduous trees will have a tendency to kind of come back up again at the tips. So I try and wire that in here too. So I'm going to continue kind of playing with this and wiring these branches a little bit, or bending these branches that have been wired. I could certainly add more wire if necessary. But I can play with this a little bit while we have a few more questions if we have them.
So Karina would like some more information about creating instead of buying bonsai trees. Mm-hmm. So when you took this tree, when you this specific plant, you've got some dead roots there. It used to be in a bigger pot. How do you take a bigger plant that you bought at Lowe's or wherever in the big plastic container and get it to the point where you're down in a smaller pot? Are you pruning roots, or what exactly are you doing?
So this is a great question, and it's actually one of the things that I love most about bonsai, is creating bonsai rather than just purchasing bonsai. In fact, there's very few plants that I have purchased as bonsai. I want to create them. So whether that is something that you bought at Lowe's or something that you've dug up out of your own garden, you always want to keep that the health of the tree first, right? But if the tree is strong enough, healthy enough, demonstrating that it can handle actions on that tree, and yes, that does take some time and some experience perhaps to really figure out when that is. But then that's when you kind of take those signals from the tree to do some of that work. So repotting, which is to say taking it out of one pot, doing root pruning, and then putting it back into a pot, is a very standard and regular activity that is part of bonsai. Have you guys ever heard of the Yamaki pine? You can't just say yes and nod to me. There's a white pine that is at the National Bonsai and Penjing Museum that has been in a pot being cared for by a human being, checked to see if it needs water every day. And it's been in a pot since the 1600s. It is literally a tree that's been in a pot for 500 years. And that tree is never going to survive if it stays in the pot and never comes out of the pot. It has to be occasionally. How often depends on the use of the tree, the species of the tree, the vigor and how fast it's growing, etc. But it has to be taken out of a pot. The roots have to be pruned, and then you have to get it back in the pot, and you freshen up the soil in the spaces that you've created by pruning some of the roots off. And you want to take very good care of that root ball, because that is the life of the tree. But that process is a very, very normal and expected part of the bonsai training process. And so getting a plant to that point where it can be repotted, where it can be taken out of the pot and put into a different pot after some root pruning, is one of the things you're going to be doing. So the question is, to get back to our styling bonsai, when do you know you can do that? Well, if you've got a tree that's strong and healthy and it's growing, then you should be able to take some roots off. And so the real question becomes, how fast can you do it? Because there are some trees that you need to do some root pruning and then put them in a pot that's still bigger than you want in the end. But you're taking steps on a process, right? You're taking steps on a journey toward getting that tree into a pot that's the size that we want for the design of our end tree. And so some of that is imagining and visualizing what that end tree will be. So sometimes that means multiple repots, and you don't repot more than once a year. And you repot most trees in the spring, right before they start spring growth. And so that, that process of repotting, and then maybe letting it grow in that pot that you've just put it into for a couple of years, possibly, before the next repotting, when you're going to try and get it down into a smaller pot. I mean, this is the kind of pace that we're talking about. So it does take some time, but if we assume that a tree that we buy from Lowe's is healthy, I don't know if we can always assume that, but if we take that assumption, then we can think, okay, well, so maybe the first spring after I've purchased a plant, I could consider repotting it for the first time and at least making that pot a little bit smaller. So it's definitely a process. So root pruning along with the repotting process, and top pruning, but a lot of times those go together. I'm going to put a guy wire on that to really pull that down.
So the wires you're using right now, how long will that wire stay on that plant? And do you only wire larger plants, or can you also wire smaller plants?
You can absolutely wire any plant at all. The wire, how long it stays on depends on the speed that the plant is growing. Here's how wire works. We take a branch we put wire on it to support it externally. We put the branch into a new position, and the wire is the only thing holding that branch there. But the goal is to have no wire on it and the branch to stay. So how does that work? What happens is the plant, as it grows, continues to build new wood across all of its surfaces that are alive, right? So this woody branch, like we know, as a tree grows, it builds new rings each year, right? So that new ring of new growth that this tree is creating is being grown in the position that it's being held at right now. And so it's that new growth of wood that is actually going to be the thing that holds the branch in place after we take the wire off. So the short answer to the question of how long does the wire stay on is as long as you can. But what's happening is wood is growing underneath it, and the only way to get the wire to hold is to wrap the wire right up against the surface of the branch. So as that branch starts thickening, which we need to happen, we don't want it to thicken so much that the wire would actually create scars in the branch. So then we need to remove that wire when it gets to that point where the branch is thickening so much that it could cause some damage. For an older tree, and I would consider this an older tree just by the looks of this trunk, it was probably in the ground for 30 years or more. And so as an older tree, it doesn't grow with the same speed and vigor of a young tree, but it's had some significant work done to it, roots pruned, and pruning those roots and cutting back branches kind of kickstarts the tree into a more youthful activity, right? Activity level. So the branches or the growth on this has been quite long. I mean, this was like 1 year's growth, where we get several inches coming out, and some of these really came out over 1 year. So those long branches show a youth, but how fast these thicken up depends on how strong the growth is. And so I actually watch it visually. If I can look and see like, yep, the wire still looks very much on the surface, and you kind of get used to being able to see that difference. Then you have to cut or unwind the wire to remove it without damaging the tree. And sometimes you do that and the branch doesn't quite hold, and that means that you'll have to rewire again. So it can be quite a process, but once you get the main branch structure in place, then less wiring is needed over time, and you can get more to like a prune to shape type of situation, especially with a boxwood. Some plants need wiring all the time. Other plants need less wiring and more pruning. So that's an interesting kind of variation from species to species as well.
Another audience question: how often do you use fertilizer for your plants, and does it depend on the species?
I would say the frequency is not such a thing, so much a dependent on species thing as the amount of fertilizer. There are some species that just want heavier fertilizer, and some species that will get some benefit from not being too heavily fertilized. Actually, Japanese maples are a good example of that. In the spring, if I were to start fertilizing them as soon as the growth starts, like for Japanese maples here, it's like in March, right? They'll start growing. And if they get a lot of fertilizer as they start growing, they'll grow too strong and too fast. And instead of a tight little compact tree with a lot of leaves that are in tight, this will just grow really long extensions that have long internode spaces from one leaf to the next leaf. So I don't want that. So I actually don't fertilize my Japanese, I fertilize my Japanese maples very lightly in the spring. And once we get to midsummer, like now, they get a stronger dose of fertilizer so that they can just be building their strength for the coming winter and for next year's growing season. So yeah, it varies. And one of the things that you'll see in bonsai is that there's lots of like guidance about giving trees very low doses of fertilizer, that's another one of those things that's very much kind of like the right thing to do for a much more developed tree. But a lot of our trees need, what am I saying? They need higher doses of fertilizer because they're still in development, right? You don't like give a super low dose to a tree that you're still trying to grow branches on, right? But if your trees, like your trunk is set and your branches are set and you're just trying to get tons and tons of really fine growth at the tips, rather than long growth, then you want to control the fertilizer. So for the vast majority of us, stronger fertilizer is appropriate. But of course, over fertilizing is a thing as well, and you don't want to burn your trees.
Are there any plants that you can cut the stem and plant the stem to grow another bonsai?
Absolutely. Now we're talking about propagation. And there are a lot of different types of trees that you can do that with. Tropicals like the ficus are notoriously easy. You can literally cut a branch off and plunk it into a little pot with soil in it. And as long as you keep it watered, that thing's probably going to grow roots. Other plants are more difficult. I've found that boxwood do not propagate easily. I don't know if everybody's familiar with the concept of air layering, but that would be the idea of trying to cut a ring around at a particular place on a tree where you want to start a new plant, wrapping that cut with like something like moss that would keep it damp and keep that covered for an extended period of time, so that the plant will grow new roots coming out of that spot. And once you have new roots there, you can remove it and now you have a new plant. And that's actually how a lot of plants are propagated for the like the garden industry when you're talking about trees and shrubs. So that process doesn't work super well on boxwood. I've propagated a lot of Japanese maples through air layering, but I have some varieties that air layer really well and others that don't. This is why you have some Japanese maples, if you go buy them at the store, they've been grafted onto a stronger rootstock, because some Japanese maples have strong roots and others have weaker root systems. So that those types of things are a reality, but lots of things that can be done through air layering and cuttings that can lead to more plants, absolutely. And it's something that I consider all the time in my garden, especially if I've got a big branch that I decide I'm going to cut off, like maybe that should be a new bonsai.
Do you have any books you would recommend for people looking to get into bonsai?
One of the books that I'm reading right now, did I hide it? And drop it on the floor. Anyway, Bonsai Heresy is by Michael Hagedorn. And you can buy it through Stone Lantern. If you look up Stone Lantern online, they are the one outlet that's carrying that book. Bonsai Heresy is a really excellent recent book. And this is a fascinating thing about bonsai because there's so much information out there. But there are books that were written back in the 60s that have so much information that we should really not be following now, because they were based on the ideas that were being used at that time. And the learning, the practices in the bonsai community have continued to improve. A little scientific and modern ways of thinking have led to some improvements in some of the practices, many of which are really based on tradition more than they're based on any kind of science. And that is actually the foundation of, let me grab it real quick, the foundation of Bonsai Heresy. This is what it looks like if you guys want to go check that one out. And it's 56 myths exposed using science and tradition. So he's really comparing that kind of science versus tradition idea. I had actually held on to this. I'll go ahead and share it with you now, because I was reading this and thinking about you guys. recently, and Michael's writing in here, and he says sometimes he's out at a place doing a little demonstration, and people will come by and they'll ask questions, and I'll talk to them, and he says someone will inevitably get more curious about bonsai and begin to think about having one. And I try my best to talk them out of it. And he'll say, this tree requires 3 or 4 waterings on a summer day. Having a bonsai can keep you busier than having a dog. And if they don't flinch at that, then we talk more earnestly. So that kind of idea I thought was kind of funny, that there is so much to learn. But this is nice because it takes a very modern and current approach. And this book was actually published in 2020. So that's a good recommendation by far. There are lots of online resources, but finding current professionals and knowing who to listen to is a little bit tricky when you get online, because there are just folks that do bonsai in their backyard that might also really enjoy making videos or posting blogs, but you don't know for sure if they really know what they're doing or if they're just telling you what they're doing, and you don't always have follow-up to know if what they did killed the tree, and some different things like that. So I do want to make sure to warn you guys against, when you're looking for information, don't follow advice until you pay attention to where that person is. Okay. There's lots of people in Florida that are doing great things with ficus and other tropicals, but we don't live in Florida. So the things that they're doing are not safe to do here. So getting the differences is not always super easy. Another to join a club that's local so that you can talk to people about how to care for something here in Northern Virginia.
That was the last audience question we had, and I did put a couple links in the chat box. I put a link to the Northern Virginia Bonsai Society in the chat box, as well as a link to Aaron's website. Aaron, do you want to talk a little bit about what people will find on the website?
Sure. I mean, the website is something that I started about the same time that I joined the Northern Virginia Bonsai Society. At that point, I had been a bonsai practitioner for 20 years, and I thought, well, let me start sharing with people what I do, and some of the things that I am working on. So some of the times you'll just see documentation of work I'm doing on trees, but you'll also see in there some of this kind of scientifically minded questions that I have. I don't always have good scientific experiments going on, but like when I do something and I start questioning what's the best practice, those are some of the things that I'm writing about, in addition to just sharing some of what and how I do the work that I do on bonsai here in Northern Virginia. So it'll be at least locationally relevant. So you can check that out. And see what's going on there, and you can see more of my trees. Nearly 100, all in development. I don't consider any tree finished, and I probably never will, because trees are constantly growing, so they're always in development in some degree or another.
We do have a late breaking question from Brian, which I think is a great question to go out on, and that is, do you ever sell your plants?
Not yet, I guess, is the answer.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Aaron. I really enjoyed having you here. And thank you all to the audience who came out and joined us on a Monday to learn about the art of bonsai. Please check out the resources Aaron has shared with you. I'd love to see if you guys do end up creating your own. Send me some pictures. You all have my email. Our next big event is going to be on August 2nd at 7 p.m. That is going to be when food writer Michael Twitty joins us for author talk about his most recent cookbook, Rice. He does African American cuisine, and he does a lot of food anthropology. So if you have any interest in rice or those topics, please join us that day. And then, of course, we have our regular book clubs and the Friends Movie Club coming up. So please check out our calendar. I'd love to see you all at other events. Aaron, do you have any final words for our audience before we disconnect?
Just want to say thanks to everybody for joining. I hope you found it interesting. And if you have bonsai or are interested in bonsai, just keep learning, because there's tons to learn about. And if you find something helpful, whether it's on my website with Northern Virginia Bonsai Society or another club or small study group that you can work with, I definitely encourage you to work with other people as you kind of learn about this art form together. So thanks all. Have a good night.
Thank you. Have a good night.